The punch landed hard, a brutal snap of knuckles against skin. Officer Damon Carter had thrown it with confidence, expecting what always came next: a cry of pain, a stumble, submission. But this time, it didn't happen. Ava Sinclair didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. She simply turned her head back toward him, slowly, deliberately, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his with an unsettling calm. Carter's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. That wasn't the look of someone caught off guard. That wasn't the look of someone outmatched. That was the look of a predator assessing its prey. Before he could react, Ava moved. His wrist twisted at an unnatural angle. Pain flared up his arm. His balance vanished, and his knees slammed into the pavement before he even realized what was happening. His hand shot toward his gun, but it was already gone. Ava leaned in, voice a whisper, smooth and controlled. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." And for the first time ever, Officer Damon Carter felt fear. Ava Sinclair had spent years in places where death was always a breath away. She had gone undercover in drug cartels, sat across from warlords, and infiltrated terrorist cells, all without breaking a sweat. She had been trained for chaos, conditioned to react to danger before it even had a chance to touch her. But tonight, she wasn't in a war zone. She wasn't carrying a gun, wasn't wearing tactical gear, wasn't playing the role of an operative. She was just Ava Sinclair, a woman walking home in a quiet neighborhood. Or so she thought. The streets were nearly empty, the soft glow of porch lights casting long shadows on the pavement. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. It was the kind of night that should have felt peaceful. But to Ava, something felt off. She had noticed the patrol car nearly 10 minutes ago. At first, it was just a glance in her peripheral vision, a dark silhouette idling at the corner, its headlights dimmed. She hadn't reacted. Years of training had taught her better. Never let them know you see them. Never let them know you're aware. But when she turned down another street and saw the same car creeping along the curb behind her, the message was clear. She was being watched, followed, hunted. She didn't panic. She didn't change her pace. Instead, she kept walking, every step measured, every breath controlled. Let the game play out. Let them make the first move. And they did. A sharp burst of a siren split through the air, a quick 2-second chirp that sent a ripple of tension down Ava's spine. The headlights flared behind her, bathing the pavement in a harsh white glow. The deep rumble of the engine slowed to a stop. They had made their decision. Ava exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back. She had spent years preparing for moments like this. But no matter how much training she had, it never changed the reality of what was coming next. She stopped walking, her back straight, her posture relaxed but ready. The sound of a car door opening echoed in the quiet street. Heavy boots hit the pavement. Slow, deliberate, confident. She could already tell what kind of officer this was just by the way he walked. And then she heard his voice. "Evening, ma'am," Officer Damon Carter called out, his tone sharp and clipped, more command than greeting. Ava turned around. The man standing in front of her was exactly what she expected. Mid-40s, stocky build, dark uniform stretched tight across his chest. His jaw was sharp, his expression neutral, but his eyes held something she recognized instantly, the kind of arrogance that only came from unchecked power. He was the kind of man who thought he owned the streets. Ava met his gaze, unshaken. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter took a slow step forward, one hand resting on his belt just inches from his holster. It was a silent message, one Ava had seen before. A warning, a test, a reminder of who had the power here. "You tell me," he said. "I've seen you walking around this neighborhood a little too much tonight, looking a little out of place." Ava felt a flicker of irritation rise in her chest, but she buried it. She had faced war criminals and assassins without flinching. She wasn't about to let some small-town cop get under her skin. "I live here," she said simply. Carter raised an eyebrow, amused. That right? Where exactly? She didn't answer. She knew better. If she gave him an address, he'd challenge it. If she refused, he'd claim she was being uncooperative. Either way, she had already lost in his eyes. Carter let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head like she had just confirmed something for him. You got some ID on you? Ava crossed her arms. Did I break a law? The smirk disappeared from Carter's face. You refusing to comply? His voice had lost its fake politeness. Ava held his gaze. I didn't say that. I asked if I broke a law. Because last I checked, walking down a street isn't a crime. Carter's jaw tightened. She wasn't playing by his rules, and he didn't like it. Ma'am, he said, his voice sharper now, when an officer asks for ID, you provide it. Unless you've got something to hide. Ava didn't move. She had been in enough situations like this to recognize the shift happening. The moment where power turns into aggression, where control turns into force. She could see it in his stance, the way his weight shifted forward, the way his hand lingered on his belt, just inches from his gun. This wasn't about a routine stop anymore. This was about control. Carter took another step closer. I won't ask again, he warned. Ava studied him, her mind already running through every possible scenario. She could de-escalate. She could walk away. But she had spent her entire life facing men like him, and she wasn't about to back down. Ava Sinclair held her ground, her expression unreadable. She had faced war criminals, cartel leaders, and trained assassins, and not one of them had made her flinch. Officer Damon Carter was no different. Carter, however, thought otherwise. His hand still lingered near his belt, inches from his holster, his posture screaming dominance. He was the kind of man who had spent years being obeyed, never questioned. And right now, Ava Sinclair was questioning everything. I won't ask again, Carter repeated, his voice laced with irritation. Ava exhaled slowly, keeping her hands at her sides. If you're detaining me, tell me why. Otherwise, I have no legal obligation to provide ID. Carter's lips curled into a slow smirk. That's so. You seem to know a lot about the law. He took a deliberate step closer, closing the distance between them. What exactly are you hiding? Ava didn't move, didn't give him the reaction he wanted. Nothing. But I know my rights. Carter's eyes darkened. That's cute, he muttered. Thing is, I decide how this goes. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping. And right now, it's not looking too good for you. There it was. The shift. He had made up his mind. This wasn't about ID anymore. This was about control. And he wasn't going to let her walk away without proving something to himself. Ava had seen this play out before. Too many times. The moment when authority turns into intimidation. When intimidation turns into force. She knew what was coming next. And yet, she waited. She let him make the first move. Carter's smirk disappeared. Turn around, he ordered. Ava arched an eyebrow. Excuse me? Hands behind your back. Ava didn't move. On what grounds? Resisting an officer, Carter shot back, his voice now sharp and commanding. Ava let the silence stretch between them, watching the way his jaw twitched, the way his fingers flexed, aching for her to comply. Or resist. Either option would feed his ego. Then he made his mistake. Carter reached for her. His hand clamped down on her wrist hard. The grip was rough, tight, meant to hurt. Ava felt the pressure, the intent behind it. He wanted to show her that she wasn't in control anymore, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. In an instant, Ava moved. She twisted her wrist, forcing his grip to break with ease, stepping to the side in one smooth motion. Carter barely had time to react before her hand shot up, pressing against the inside of his elbow, bending his arm at an unnatural angle. He grunted, his balance shifting. Ava didn't stop. With a calculated step, she swept her foot behind his, knocking his balance completely off. Before he knew what was happening, his knees hit the pavement, hard. The world seemed to freeze. Carter gasped, his eyes wide, his body struggling to process how he had just been disarmed and forced onto the ground in less than 3 seconds. Ava remained still, completely calm. She didn't hit him, didn't push him down, didn't escalate. She had simply taken control. Carter, however, wasn't ready to admit that. His rage exploded as he tried to stand, his hands shooting toward his belt, toward his gun. Ava had already seen it coming. His weapon was in her hands before he even realized it was gone. Carter froze. His breath hitched. For the first time since this encounter started, he wasn't in control. Ava took a step back, holding the gun firmly but not aiming it. Not a threat, just a fact. Carter's face turned red. His breathing was uneven. You. Ava tilted her head slightly, voice dangerously quiet. You just made the worst mistake of your life. Carter clenched his fists, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The power had shifted, and he knew it. But this wasn't over. Not yet. In the distance, sirens wailed. Backup was on the way. The distant wail of sirens cut through the tension, but neither Ava Sinclair nor Officer Damon Carter moved. She stood there, calm and composed, his gun in her grip. Not raised, not threatening, just a fact. He was still on his knees, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides, his face twisted with rage. You have no idea what you've just done, Carter seethed, his voice low, venomous. Ava tilted her head, her gaze sharp. I think I do. Carter pushed himself up slowly, his hands curling into fists. He knew better than to lunge at her again. The humiliation of being taken down so effortlessly still burned in his veins. But his mind was already working, searching for a way to take back control. His backup was almost here. All he had to do was flip the story before they arrived. You just assaulted an officer, he spat. You took my weapon. You know what that means? Ava's eyes remained unreadable. I know exactly what it means, she replied evenly. She could see it in his posture. He wasn't afraid of losing control. He was afraid of losing face. The sirens grew louder. A second later, the first squad car screeched to a stop at the edge of the street, lights flashing. Another followed close behind. This was where the real fight began. Carter's entire body tensed. He had mere seconds to take back the narrative. If he didn't act now, he knew he was done. So he did what men like him always did. He lied. Officer down! Officer down! Carter suddenly shouted, loud enough for the incoming officers to hear. Suspect is armed and dangerous. She attacked me. Ava didn't move, didn't react, even as she heard the car doors slam open, the heavy footfalls of more officers rushing onto the scene. She had been waiting for this. She lowered the gun slowly, keeping her movements deliberate, careful. She placed it on the ground and took a step back, raising her hands just as the first officer, Ryan Tate, rounded the patrol car, weapon drawn. Freeze! Hands where I can see them. Ava did exactly that. Tate's gaze flickered between her and Carter, confusion flickering across his face. Carter was disheveled, out of breath, his rage barely contained. Ava? She looked completely calm. She jumped me, Carter barked. Tried to take my weapon. Ava didn't blink. Your body cam will tell a different story. Tate hesitated. That one sentence had already planted a seed of doubt. The second officer, Captain Ethan Walsh, stepped forward, his presence commanding. He was older, more experienced, with the kind of sharp gaze that had seen too much. He stopped just outside the flashing lights, taking in the scene. Carter pointed at Ava, his face twisted with rage. Cuff her, now! But Walsh didn't move. He studied Carter, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the way his voice was just a little too forced. And then he looked at Ava, her steady gaze, her raised hands, the complete lack of fear or guilt in her expression. "Ma'am," Walsh said, his tone measured, "you mind explaining what happened here?" Carter's head snapped toward him. "What the hell do you mean, explain? Walsh cut him off with a simple look. Carter's mouth snapped shut. Ava exhaled slowly. "Your officer initiated an unlawful stop, escalated the situation, and used force when there was no justification. When I defended myself, he attempted to reach for his firearm. I disarmed him for my safety." Tate's brow furrowed. That didn't sound like the story Carter had just shouted across the scene. Carter let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Are you seriously going to believe this? She's making it up. Look at me. I was attacked." Walsh's gaze didn't waver. "Then you won't mind us reviewing your body cam footage?" Silence. Carter's face paled just slightly. Ava said nothing, just watching him. She had already won, because she knew what the footage would show. The moment he grabbed her first. The moment she acted only in response. The moment he reached for his weapon, not to protect himself, but to regain power. And now, under the flashing red and blue lights in front of his own officers, he was losing it all. Carter's fingers twitched. His mind was racing, scrambling for something, anything, to shift this in his favor. Then he tried again. "You know who she is, right?" Carter sneered, turning back to Ava as if suddenly remembering something. "Search her. You'll find out real quick she ain't just some random woman walking home." Walsh's jaw tightened slightly. He turned back to Ava, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, do you have identification?" Ava nodded, and then she reached into her jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, before pulling out a sleek black wallet. She flipped it open, and in the eerie glow of the flashing lights, her CIA badge gleamed. Tate took half a step back, his mouth slightly open. Walsh's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. "Carter?" He stopped breathing. The world around them seemed to freeze. "You've got to be kidding me," Carter muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava finally spoke. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next words, Officer Carter." His face twisted with something between rage and disbelief. "You're a Fed?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "I thought you weren't worried about who I was." Carter's face reddened with pure, unfiltered rage. His own words thrown back at him. Walsh exhaled, finally stepping forward. His entire demeanor shifted. "Officer Carter, you're relieved of duty until further notice. Hand over your badge and your firearm." Carter lost it. "You cannot be serious," he snapped. "You're believing her over me. She attacked me." Tate cleared his throat, suddenly speaking up. "Sir, if she was attacking you, why did you call for backup before she even fought back?" Carter turned toward him, eyes wild. "What?" Tate met his gaze, unmoving. "Your radio logs. You called it in as a resisting suspect before she ever touched you." Carter froze. Walsh took a step closer, his voice low. "I'd be very careful about lying, Carter. The body cam footage is still running." Carter was done. Ava watched as reality hit him like a freight train. His career, his reputation, everything he had built on intimidation and unchecked power, crumbling right in front of him. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Walsh turned to Ava, his tone respectful. "Miss Sinclair, I appreciate your cooperation. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and you'll be contacted for a formal statement." Ava nodded. "Of course." Carter was still standing there, his fists clenched, his entire body shaking. He looked at Ava with nothing but hate. "This isn't over," he muttered. Ava gave him a small, knowing smile. "Yes, it is." And with that, she turned and walked away. Officer Damon Carter's blood was boiling. His badge, his power, his reputation, everything was slipping away, and it was all because of her, Ava Sinclair. She stood there, calm, unreadable, not the least bit shaken. That only enraged him more. She had humiliated him. And now, in front of his own department, in front of Captain Walsh and Officer Tate, he was being told to stand down. He wasn't going to let that happen. Carter's fingers twitched. His mind raced. He had to take back control. He had to prove that he was the one in charge. And there was only one way to do that. With force. In a blur of motion, Carter lunged. Ava saw it coming before his muscles even tensed. She had been waiting for it. His arm shot forward, reaching for his gun, the one he didn't have anymore. But that didn't stop him. He was too blinded by rage to think clearly. His only goal was to bring her down. Too bad for him. Ava sidestepped smoothly, her body moving like liquid, and before Carter could process the fact that he had missed, she was already countering. Her palm shot forward, striking his forearm, redirecting his momentum. His body jerked sideways, off balance. His feet struggled for grip, but Ava wasn't done. Her knee snapped up. The impact was fast, brutal, slamming into his ribs with surgical precision. Carter let out a strangled gasp as pain exploded through his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't used to this. He was used to being in control. He was used to winning. But right now, he was losing. Badly. Carter tried to recover, but Ava was already moving again, her foot sweeping out, clipping his knee from the side. His balance shattered completely. He went down. Hard. His back slammed into the pavement with a dull thud, his breath leaving him in a sharp, choked wheeze. Ava stood over him, composed, not even winded. Carter's chest heaved as he tried to push himself up, rage clouding his vision. You... Ava's foot pressed lightly against his wrist, right where he had been reaching for a non-existent weapon. His head snapped up, eyes wild. She didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. You lost. The street was dead silent. Nobody moved. Then, a single voice. Enough. Captain Ethan Walsh. His tone was sharp, final, leaving no room for argument. The weight of his authority settled over the scene like a crushing force. Ava lifted her foot from Carter's wrist, stepping back without taking her eyes off him. Carter's hands shook with rage as he forced himself up onto his elbows, his face twisted with fury. "You think you're smart," he growled. Ava's lips barely twitched. "I don't think, Carter. I know." His face burned red. He had never been this powerless in his life. And it was killing him. Walsh turned to Officer Tate. "Get him up." Tate hesitated, then moved. He grabbed Carter by the arm, hauling him to his feet. Carter jerked away violently. "Don't touch me," he spat. Walsh's voice dropped into a warning tone. "Carter, stand down." Carter's fists clenched, his jaw locked, his entire body coiled like a live wire. And for a moment, Ava thought he might actually be stupid enough to try again. But then, he hesitated. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew. This time, nobody would be on his side. His backup wasn't going to save him. His badge wasn't going to protect him. And worst of all, Ava Sinclair wasn't afraid of him. Walsh turned to Ava. "Miss Sinclair, we're placing Officer Carter under immediate investigation for misconduct and unnecessary use of force." Carter whipped his head toward Walsh. "You're siding with her?" Walsh's jaw tightened. "I'm siding with the truth." Silence. Tate cleared his throat. "We should get statements." Walsh nodded. "Secure the scene. Carter, you're coming with me." Carter looked ready to explode. "You have no idea what you're doing." Walsh met his glare, unshaken. "Yeah, I do. I'm cleaning up my department." Ava watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Carter had walked into this fight thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was just another disgraced officer getting escorted off the scene. And he knew it. Ava turned, already done with the conversation. As she started to walk away, Carter's voice rang out one last time. "This isn't over." Ava stopped, looking over her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable. Then, a small smirk. "Yes, it is." And with that, she walked away. Carter stood there, seething, shaking, defeated, but there was nothing he could do, because he had already lost. The red and blue lights flashed across the quiet street, painting everything in rapid pulses of color. The tension in the air was thick, the silence deafening. Carter had lost, but he wasn't done fighting. Ava Sinclair stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but alert. She had already dismantled him physically, broken him in front of his own colleagues. Now came the real battle, the one for truth. 2 more squad cars pulled up, doors flying open as officers stepped out. The weight of the department had arrived. The first officer to approach was Lieutenant Marcus Fields, a broad-shouldered man with the aura of someone who had seen too much in his career. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in Carter's disheveled state, Ava's calm presence, and Captain Walsh's unreadable expression. "What the hell is going on here?" Fields demanded. Carter immediately took his shot. "She assaulted me," he barked. "Resisted arrest, stole my gun, took me down. This woman is dangerous." Ava didn't react. Fields' gaze flicked to Walsh. "That true, Captain?" Walsh didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Officer Ryan Tate. "Tate," Walsh said, his voice calm but firm. "Tell him what you saw." Tate hesitated for half a second. Then he squared his shoulders and spoke. "Carter initiated the stop without cause. He escalated first. When Miss Sinclair refused to comply with an unlawful detainment, Carter went hands-on. She acted in self-defense." Fields frowned, his jaw tightening. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir." Carter's face twisted with rage. "This is bullshit. You're all taking her side? She's playing you, can't you see that?" Fields ignored him, looking at Walsh again. "Captain?" Walsh exhaled. "Carter's been relieved of duty pending an internal affairs investigation." Carter lost it. "You have no right," he snapped, stepping forward aggressively. "This is my department. This is my career, and you're just going to throw it all away over some—" "Stand down." Walsh's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. Carter froze. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. Fields turned to Ava. His eyes scanned her, sizing her up, assessing whether Carter's wild accusations had any weight. "Miss Sinclair," he said finally, "do you have identification?" Ava didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her jacket, her movements slow, precise. She pulled out her sleek black wallet and flipped it open. The moment Fields' eyes landed on the CIA badge, his entire demeanor shifted. His back straightened. His lips parted slightly, then pressed into a tight line. Carter saw it, too, and for the first time, he understood. Ava could see the exact second the realization hit him. She wasn't just some civilian. She wasn't just another woman he could intimidate, control, or frame. He had attacked a government operative. The blood drained from his face, his fists clenched, but he didn't say a word. Because what could he say? Fields exhaled through his nose and turned to Walsh. "You said Internal Affairs is already involved?" Walsh nodded. "They'll have my report in an hour." Fields stared at Carter for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned back to Ava. "Would you like to press charges?" Carter's head snapped up. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Ava studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she shook her head. "No." Fields raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Ava smirked slightly. "I don't need to. His career is already over." Carter visibly swallowed. She was right. He had spent years wielding his badge like a weapon, believing himself untouchable. And in just a few minutes, she had taken it all away. He had lost his power, his badge, his reputation, everything. Fields sighed and turned to Carter. "Hand over your badge and department-issued firearm. You're done." Carter's breath hitched. "You can't be serious," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Fields didn't respond. He just held out his hand. Slowly, reluctantly, Carter reached for his badge. His fingers trembled as he unpinned it from his chest, staring at it like it was a part of his soul. Then, with a heavy click, he placed it in Fields' hand. Next, his gun. The final piece of his authority. And just like that, Officer Damon Carter was no longer a cop. Walsh exhaled and looked at Tate. "Escort him out of here." Tate hesitated for a brief second, then nodded. He stepped forward, grabbing Carter by the arm. "Let's go," he said, his tone neutral. Carter didn't resist. He just let himself be led away, his entire body slumped. Broken. Ava watched him go, her arms crossed over her chest. She had won, and Carter knew it. As Carter disappeared into the squad car, Fields turned back to Ava. "I assume we'll be hearing from your people?" Ava nodded. "Expect a formal statement from my agency soon." Walsh exhaled. "I don't suppose you'll tell me what exactly it is you do?" Ava smirked. "No." Walsh huffed a short laugh. "Didn't think so." He extended his hand. "I don't say this often, but thank you. You just cleaned up a mess that's been rotting in this department for years." Ava shook his hand, her grip firm. "Just doing my part." Walsh studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You ever need anything, you call me." Ava nodded once. "Likewise." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The streetlights cast long shadows as Ava disappeared into the darkness, her mind already moving forward. Carter was gone. Justice had been served, but Ava knew this wasn't the last time she'd deal with men like him. There would always be more, and when they showed up, she would be ready. The morning after the confrontation, the city woke up to a storm. It started small, an internal report, whispers among officers, quiet conversations in break rooms. But then the footage leaked. A neighbor had been recording from their front porch. Every moment was captured. Carter's aggressive approach, his attempt to detain Ava without cause, the way he escalated, grabbed her, forced her to defend herself. The way she took him down in seconds, the moment he reached for his gun, and the moment she stripped him of it effortlessly. By noon, the video was everywhere. Headlines blew up. "Rogue officer attacks woman. Unaware she's a CIA agent." Leaked footage shows Officer Carter's brutal attempt to frame an innocent woman. CIA operative takes down corrupt cop, and the department knew. The police department went into full damage control mode. Captain Walsh and Lieutenant Fields were pulled into emergency meetings. Internal Affairs had already been investigating Carter, but now there was no avoiding the truth. By 3 p.m., a press conference was called. The chief of police stood in front of flashing cameras, reading from a carefully prepared statement. "Effective immediately," the chief's voice echoed through the packed room. "Officer Damon Carter has been terminated from the force. His actions were in direct violation of department policy and do not reflect the values of our officers." The room erupted with questions. Will he face criminal charges? Did you know he had a history of misconduct? Are there more officers like him? The chief's response was tight-lipped. "The district attorney's office is reviewing the case for potential charges. We take these matters seriously." Ava stood in her small apartment, watching the press conference on her laptop. She wasn't surprised by the way the department was handling it. They weren't firing Carter because it was the right thing to do. They were doing it because they got caught. She took a slow sip of coffee, her mind already thinking 3 steps ahead. Carter might be gone, but the system that protected him, that still existed. Her phone buzzed on the table, a familiar number. Her handler. She answered. Sinclair. A beat of silence, then. Case closed. Carter's done. She exhaled. Any retaliation from his people? We're watching. He's angry, but without his badge, he's just another disgraced man looking for a fight he won't win. Ava smirked. Good. Her handler hesitated. Then, what's next? Ava glanced back at the screen. The press conference was wrapping up, reporters already shifting their focus. What was next? Ava didn't have an answer. Not yet. She had spent years fighting battles in the shadows, taking down enemies most people didn't even know existed. But this was different. This wasn't an overseas mission. This wasn't a classified op. This was her own backyard. And it was rotting. Ava ended the call and shut her laptop. That evening, Carter showed up at the precinct for the last time. 2 internal affairs officers were waiting. A folder sat on the desk, filled with evidence of his past misconduct. Every complaint that had been buried, every excessive force report that had been dismissed, every moment he had abused his power, believing he'd never face consequences. And now, it was all laid out in front of him. The DA was preparing charges, assault, false reporting, possibly even abuse of power. Carter sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He had nothing left to say. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. His reputation shattered. And the worst part, Ava Sinclair wasn't even there to see it. She didn't need to be. She had already won. 3 days later, Ava was walking home when she noticed a car parked a few houses down. She already knew who it was before she even got close. Carter. His hands were on the steering wheel, knuckles white, his face partially obscured by shadows. He wasn't here to attack. Not yet. Ava stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, turning her head just slightly, enough to let him know she saw him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Carter looked like a man on the edge, boiling with rage but shackled by powerlessness. Without his badge, without the authority of the department behind him, he was just another angry man sitting in his car, staring at a woman he couldn't control. Ava didn't smile, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just tilted her head slightly like she was studying him. And then, she turned away. Carter's car peeled off a second later, his tires screeching as he sped into the night. Ava exhaled slowly. He wasn't done with her, but that was fine. Neither was she. What do you think? Should officers like Carter face harsher consequences? Was justice truly served, or do these problems run deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if you love stories that expose corruption, challenge power, and keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be heard. The fight isn't over, and neither are we.